At Savannah Airport, Georgia, an 80-year-old man carrying a worn-out suitcase walked slowly through the terminal, only to be denied boarding because of outdated identification. No one knew he was Edward Brooks, a United States Marine, a legendary flight instructor from 1972, the man who saved countless young pilots during the war. A viral video changed everything. The Navy organized an honorary flight to restore his long-lost glory. Have you ever met someone like Edward, quietly carrying history, just waiting to be remembered? Share their story in the comments and subscribe to help keep these living legends alive. Every Tuesday morning, Edward Brooks pushed open the door to the small airport in Savannah, Georgia, like a ritual no one paid attention to. He carried an old brown fabric suitcase, its handle frayed. He dragged it across the floor, creating a faint sound that almost disappeared beneath the rush of daily life. On his head, a faded baseball cap shadowed his pale blue eyes, eyes that had witnessed things most people only read about in history books. Over his checkered shirt, he wore a thin gray wool jacket, the color like wisps of smoke from a long-forgotten memory. At 80 years old, he walked slowly, his back slightly hunched, leaning on a polished bamboo cane. But every step was steady, as if he were still marching, no longer to the sound of gunfire, but to the steady rhythm of time tapping against worn knees. Airport staff called him Mr. Ed, smiling at him like an old acquaintance. They assumed he was a kind, retired man, perhaps heading to visit grandchildren in Florida. What they didn't know was this. For years, he had never gone there. He always booked the cheapest ticket, sat in the very last row, near the noise, the cramped space, but he never once complained. He made no requests, never grumbled when flights were delayed. For him, simply being here, where planes take off and return, was enough. As if, with every visit, he was quietly chasing something no one else could see. On the morning of June 15th, 2025, Mr. Ed returned once more. But that day, something was different. He approached the check-in counter and pulled from his jacket pocket an old military ID, the paper yellowed, its corners worn. On it was printed the name Edward T. Brooks, along with a military serial number from the 1970s. The card trembled slightly in his hand, just like his aged heart, quietly pulsing to the rhythm of memory. That day, the staff member on duty was Kyle, a young man, newly hired. He held the card, furrowed his brow, then shook his head. "Sir, this ID isn't valid. You'll need a passport or a driver's license." Edward didn't argue. He simply reached into his pocket again and pulled out another piece of paper, a military certificate, also faded with time. Kyle glanced at it, then shook his head again. "I'm sorry, but this isn't considered valid identification." Edward's voice was barely above a whisper, not angry, not bitter. Just the quiet of a man far too familiar with being turned away. He gave a gentle nod. Dragging his suitcase away from the counter, he found an empty bench in the corner of the terminal. He sat down, placed his hands atop his cane, and stared at the electronic flight board. His eyes gleamed with something hard to describe, not frustration, not disappointment, but calculation, as if he were looking far beyond the flight in front of him. No one stopped to notice him. No one asked why an elderly man dressed so plainly showed up at the airport every week like it was some kind of ritual. But if they had stopped long enough, they might have noticed his hands trembling slightly, seen the hardened calluses, not from his cane, but from years of handling weapons. They might have caught the look in his eyes, eyes that once belonged to a soldier who had seen far too many things no one ever should. What they couldn't know was that inside that old suitcase, There weren't many clothes, but there was always one photograph, faded, fragile. 4 soldiers standing in the damp jungle, smiling in the rain. 3 of them never made it back, and for years now, Edward had returned to the airport, as if waiting for a flight that would bring them home, or at least carry him to where they had fallen. That day, June 15th, no one could possibly have known what was stirring inside the old man's heart. But one thing was certain. For Edward Brooks, it was not just another Tuesday. At the same moment, Edward Brooks sat quietly in the waiting area. A group of young officers from the United States Navy strode into the terminal. They had just completed grueling training at Pensacola, Florida, and were on their way back to San Diego. Their uniforms were immaculate. Their pilots' wings gleamed on their left chests. Their leather boots shone under the terminal lights. They moved with pride and energy. Laughter rang out. Passengers' eyes followed these young men, the newest generation ready to conquer the skies. Among them, Lieutenant Daniel Harper stood out, 28 years old, tall and broad-shouldered. His blonde hair cropped to regulation length, his sharp eyes reflecting intelligence and discipline. As the son of a veteran Gulf War pilot, Daniel grew up on stories laced with gunpowder smoke, tales his father told of the seasoned flyers from the Vietnam era, men who flew not by modern instruments, but by instinct, by intuition, by heart. To Daniel, they were silent legends. As the officers passed the seating area, Daniel's gaze drifted to a solitary figure in the far corner. There sat an old man, baseball cap faded, thin wool jacket, an ancient suitcase at his feet. Edward Brooks, back straight, bony hands gently caressing a worn military ID, as if speaking to a piece of memory. Daniel paused. Something about him was uncanny, not the austerity of age, but the weighty dignity radiating from his posture, a silence heavy with meaning. He could not explain it, yet his heart was drawn to him. The way Edward laid his hands on his cane, the way his eyes never left the flight board, all spoke of something extraordinary. Daniel was about to approach when a loud complaint erupted at the check-in counter. A passenger shouted about a delayed flight. The clamor made Edward glance up. For a single beat, airport lights slanted across his shoulder, revealing a faint scar trailing down his neck, hidden beneath the collar. Daniel froze. That was no ordinary scar. As a pilot, Daniel had seen similar wounds, ones born of cockpit collisions or in-air explosions. A scar dried and aged, yet carrying a horror its bearer would never speak of. Daniel leaned toward his teammate, lowering his voice. This man, he's not just any elderly customer. But before he could move, something unexpected happened. A nearby passenger, a middle-aged woman who had quietly witnessed Edward's ID being rejected, pulled out her phone. She raised it. She recorded the entire moment, the silent refusal, the old man's sorrowful yet composed retreat from the counter, his firm grip on the suitcase as he moved into the shadows. Minutes later, that video was live on social media. Its caption was brief but furious. Savannah Airport denies boarding to a veteran simply because his papers are outdated. Shameful. The image of Edward, back straight, grip on his cane, eyes lost in distance, was clipped from the video and spread like wildfire. The online community exploded. Thousands of questions flooded the comments. Outrage poured in. Apologies flowed on behalf of a society that had grown too indifferent. Daniel saw the post on a teammate's phone less than 10 minutes later. His heart pounded. A swell of unease rose in his chest, that helpless sensation when one realizes a crucial truth was just overlooked. That man was more than a frail old veteran. He was a living fragment of history, gasping in silence, and Daniel knew he had to go back. The video of the old man, with his bamboo cane and haunted eyes, being turned away at the check-in desk, didn't remain just another random post. It ignited like a spark in dry brush. It spread at lightning speed across X. Within hours, thousands of shares and tens of thousands of comments filled the clip's thread. People were outraged. People were saddened. Yet nobody could hide their curiosity. Who is this old man? Why does he carry that worn-out ID like a treasure? Amid the hundreds of accounts discussing the clip, a reputable military account spoke up. This person recognized not only the faded ID card, but also the distinctive symbol of the U.S. Marine Corps, a unit that trained combat pilots in the 1970s. That emblem appeared only on special military IDs, issued to those who served in elite classified training programs. That revelation immediately captured the attention of Lieutenant Daniel Harper, the young officer now settled into his seat on the flight from Savannah to San Diego. He opened his phone. He watched the video again with new eyes. This was no longer the image of a frail, elderly man denied boarding. It was the presence of something unacknowledged, a story untold. A sudden intuition surged in Daniel's chest. He dialed his father, a seasoned veteran pilot who had served at Cherry Point, North Carolina, the premier combat flight training center during the height of the Southeast Asia conflict. "Dad, have you ever heard the name Edward T. Brooks?" Daniel asked, his voice dropping low. Silence followed on the other end, then his father spoke slowly, distinctly. "More than you know. He's the man who saved me from that cockpit fire back in 1973. I owe him my life." Daniel went still. His father continued, his tone warm yet choked with emotion. Edward T. Brooks was more than a Marine. He had been one of the most gifted flight instructors in the Skyhawks program, a top-secret 1972 initiative to rapidly train combat pilots for dangerous missions in Southeast Asia. At 27, Edward had trained over 50 young pilots. Many later said that only those hours in the air with him saved their lives in brutal dogfights. And then there was an event Daniel's father had never shared before, a crash during an A-4 Skyhawk test flight. The engine failed at low altitude. The aircraft burst into flames. The crew panicked. Yet Edward held firm. He flew the burning plane to a safe landing, despite suffering severe burns to his neck and arms. Every crew member survived. Edward refused any medals, offering only, "I was doing my duty." After the war, Edward quietly left the service. He never attended ceremonies, never appeared in the media, never penned a memoir. He chose a quiet life in Savannah, an anonymous shadow amid the bustle. All he kept was that old ID, not for its legal value, but as the final remnant of a youth marked by glory and loss. Seated on the plane, Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He felt awakened from a dream. The man he almost approached, the man whose gaze had stopped him in his tracks, was the unsung hero who trained and saved so many lives, including his father's. Daniel immediately reposted the video on X, but this time, it wasn't just a reaction, it was a declaration. "This is no ordinary old man. He is a hero, the man who saved my father, and the one who taught a generation of pilots how to survive when all the sky was against them." That brief tweet was shared thousands of times in under an hour, and somewhere in Savannah Airport, Edward Brooks still sat, eyes fixed on the runway, unaware that the past he'd hidden for half a century was finally being spoken aloud by the world. Dear audience, please take a moment to relax or sip a glass of water, then listen on, because more surprises lie ahead. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see people tuning in from around the world. Comment number 1. If you enjoyed the story, that way we can continue bringing you even more great stories. The story of old Edward Brooks, turned away at the check-in desk because of his worn military ID, did not end on social media. After Lieutenant Daniels' tweet spread, attention climbed the chain of command. Within hours, it reached Colonel Sarah Mitchell's desk at Pensacola Naval Air Station, Florida, where Daniel had just completed training. As one of the Navy's most senior officers, Colonel Mitchell was not easily moved by online posts. Yet, when she saw the image of that frail old man standing in the terminal, his eyes neither resentful nor pleading, but quietly bearing a lifetime of forgotten service, her heart ached. She read Daniel's share carefully, then ordered her aide to retrieve every file on Edward T. Brooks at once. A few hours later, everything fell into place. Brooks had been a top flight instructor in the classified Skyhawks program of the early 1970s. He not only trained dozens of young pilots for the Southeast Asia Theater, but had been nominated for the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest honors a naval aviator can receive. Yet he had refused it, not out of humility, but because he never wanted the spotlight. In that 1973 report, Edward himself wrote one line, "I was only doing my duty. I do not seek recognition." Those words would not let Colonel Mitchell rest. To her, this was no mere procedural error. It was an opportunity to right a half-century wrong, to honor a nameless hero. She issued an urgent order. Within 48 hours, the Navy would arrange a special honorary flight for Edward Brooks. On the morning of June 18th, 3 days after the first video went viral, Edward was invited back to Savannah Airport. He was told that management wished to issue a formal apology for the incident. He did not suspect a thing. He still wore his familiar faded wool jacket. He still carried his old suitcase. He still leaned on the bamboo cane that had carried him through so many seasons. His face was calm, even weary, as though he were merely embarking on yet another disappointing trip. But then, when the terminal doors swung open, everything stopped. Before him stood a line of young officers in crisp uniforms. They stood at attention and saluted. At the center was Lieutenant Daniel Harper, his eyes blazing as if he saw his own future mirrored in the man before him. Behind them rested a C-130 Hercules transport plane, painted with the American flag. Its banner fluttered in the bright morning sun. To the right, Colonel Mitchell approached, holding a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside lay the Distinguished Service Medal, an honor Edward had been owed since 1973. Edward stood motionless. His eyes narrowed, not from the glare, but from tears forming. For that breathless moment, no one spoke. There were no engines roaring, no boots stamping, only hearts pounding in chests. He glanced around, his gaze settling on Daniel. Then he looked up at the medal in Colonel Mitchell's hands. Something within him broke. Not pride, not triumph, but the simple relief of being seen, of being acknowledged. After so many silent years, living out of sight, he was finally called by his true name. "Edward T. Brooks," Colonel Mitchell said, her voice solemn yet full of feeling. "On behalf of the United States Navy, we apologize for leaving you alone too long. Today, we not only honor you, we bring you home." No one applauded, no one interrupted, for they all understood. An apology like that needs no fanfare. It only needs respect. Edward nodded once, his lips pressed together as if holding back words. Then he stepped toward the C-130. Each footfall carried him back through memory, the faces of fallen comrades, the scent of smoke in the cockpit, the static-laced radio calls, and the decades of silence that followed the war. On that day, Edward did more than board a flight. He returned, not to where he had been, but to the place he'd always belonged, as a hero. On the morning of June 19th, the sun had barely crested Savannah's horizon, its pale rays stretching across the dew-wet runway. A sturdy C-130 Hercules sat ready on the sleek black tarmac. Its fuselage bore bold white letters, honoring Edward T. Brooks. No longer just a transport plane, today it carried a special mission, to bring a hero back to where he belonged, in the pride of an entire generation. All across the airport, people stood in dense clusters. They had not come out of curiosity. They had come out of respect. Airport staff placed hands over hearts. Families of aviators held young children in quiet reverence. The people of Savannah, where Edward had lived unseen for decades, stood watch. All eyes fixed on the silver-haired man in the worn wool sweater, stepping slowly toward the aircraft, his faithful brown suitcase in hand. The auxiliary cockpit glowed with a gentle warmth. Edward was invited to take the co-pilot's seat beside Lieutenant Daniel Harper, the young officer he'd never truly spoken with before. Daniel remained silent. He said nothing, but his gaze held profound reverence. For the first time in 50 years, Edward touched the instrument panel. His hands, thin, withered, rested on the flight controls with uncanny surety. It was as if time had paused, a brief hush before everything resumed. He did not actually fly, but for him, this moment was enough. He was touching his own history. Daniel sat quietly beside him, studying him intently. No questions were needed. Daniel understood. In the soft golden light filtering through the cockpit glass, he saw the focus in Edward's eyes, the focus of someone who had once flown through enemy fire, who had made split-second life-or-death decisions. Once the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the radio crackled to life, solemn, resonant. This is the honorary flight for Lieutenant Colonel Edward T. Brooks, the man who shaped the skies for our generation. The crew fell silent. Above them, high in the heavens, not a word was spoken. Yet everyone felt it. The sky that day was more than empty air. It was witness to a long overdue, heartfelt tribute. After nearly 5 hours in flight, the Hercules touched down at Miramar, California, the wartime training hub where Edward once walked through corridors lined with marching boots and watched young aviators depart with bright yet trembling eyes. On the Miramar tarmac, a Navy honor guard stood ready, their ranks impeccable, the national flag fluttering in the breeze. Behind them sat rows of former pilots trained by Edward, now silver-haired like him, but their eyes still filled with gratitude. When Edward descended from the aircraft, his footsteps were slow but unwavering. Each step imprinted itself onto the runway of memory. No assistance needed, no escort required, for he knew the rhythm of this place. One by one, the veteran pilots approached him in reverent silence. Each placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet yet profound gesture, a thank you, an honor, a soldier's way of saying, "I live because of you." Then Colonel Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, holding an intricately carved wooden box. Inside lay the Distinguished Service Medal, the award Edward had been owed since 1973. She stood tall. Her voice rang out across the wind-swept expanse. For valor and dedication in combat training, Lieutenant Colonel Edward T. Brooks saved countless lives and shaped the future of naval aviation. Today, we fulfill an overdue promise. Edward reached out to accept the medal. The entire airfield fell utterly silent. There was no applause. None was needed. The moment was too sacred for noise. He remained still, gaze fixed on the runway. In the distance, an FA-18 Hornet streaked through the sky, tearing through the clouds. Edward narrowed his eyes, not against the glare, but as visions of those 1970s A-4 Skyhawks returned to his mind, wings cutting through rain, carrying young men and unending dreams. And then he smiled. Not because he was being honored, but because, at last, he had come home. After that honorary flight, Savannah Airport was never the same. Right at Gate 3, where Edward had once been turned away over an outdated ID, a small bronze plaque had been installed. Not large, not ostentatious, yet each engraved word stopped passers-by in their tracks. Dedicated to Lieutenant Colonel Edward T. Brooks, the silent hero of the skies. That plaque gleamed in the morning light, and whenever someone walked by, they felt something sacred stir within. For this spot had once been the anonymous place of a great man, forgotten amid the rush of travelers. Now it marked the beginning of a journey of recognition, not just for Edward, but for all who had served quietly. Word of his story spread throughout Savannah, not via grand headlines, but by genuine word of mouth among locals. Those who once passed him by now paused. They looked more closely, asked more questions. Some young families even brought their children, pointing and whispering, "He's a hero." The community decided to raise funds to repair Edward's weathered red brick home at the end of Maple Street. But when they offered, he shook his head. "Use that money for younger veterans," he said, his voice soft yet unwavering. "They need it more than I do." They fell silent, not because of his refusal, but because of the profound heart behind his words. Edward had never lived for himself. In the cockpit and after the war, he always thought of others first. And so, every Tuesday morning, the familiar image returned. Edward Brooks, with his tattered brown canvas suitcase, his faded baseball cap shadowing pale eyes, still walked into the airport as before. But everything had changed. Now, staff bowed their heads in genuine respect. No longer a polite nod, but a heartfelt gesture to a living legend. Passengers recognized him, often stopping to inquire, sometimes asking for a photo, sometimes simply to say, "Thank you." He never complained. He never showed discomfort. Yet his gaze still lingered on the runway, where planes continued to take off in succession, as if carrying a piece of his heart skyward. Edward's story did not end in Savannah. On X, thousands shared their own reflections. About him, about their fathers, about forgotten veterans. One wrote, "I saw him in the terminal, but I didn't know who he was. I wish I'd asked his name." Another recalled, "My dad was just like Edward. Now I know what I must do." Lieutenant Daniel Harper, who had accompanied him on that honorary flight, launched a project called Skyhawk's Legacy, a living archive of wartime aviators. They interviewed, documented, and recreated the stories of those who had flown, fought, and returned in silence, unknown to the world. Edward did not take part in the project. He disliked cameras. He was unused to lights or lengthy write-ups. Yet one day, Daniel received a handwritten note from him, just one line. "Teach them to fly well, the way we did." Daniel kept that note in his wallet. folded carefully as one would preserve a sacred charge, and the story closed as it began, in quiet. On another Tuesday morning, Edward sat once more on the familiar bench in the waiting area, still wearing that old wool jacket, still hands resting on his cane, eyes fixed on the long runway ahead. His cap obscured his gaze, but if you stood close, you would see a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile of glory, but of peace. As though he had reclaimed his sky, not by machine, but by the recognition of remembering hearts. We, at Veteran Best Stories, believe that heroes like Edward don't need the spotlight, but they deserve to be remembered. Do you know someone like him? A veteran quietly carrying history, waiting for someone to look deeper? If so, share their story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so we can preserve these legacies before they fade away. Because next time you see an old man seated alone in an airport, leaning on his cane, dragging a worn suitcase, look closely. You just might be standing beside a legend. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see someone tuning in with us from around the world. Comment number 1. If you found the story compelling, that way we can continue bringing you even more great stories.